So, thank you all for coming to our session today as part of the Stop the Stigma conference hosted by the community and Moxie Educational Services. At Stop the Stigma, we acknowledge the importance of person first language because language shapes how we understand one another. Person first language centers humanity over diagnoses or system involvement and reflects our shared commitment to dignity, respect, and equity. We also recognize that individuals may prefer identity first language, and we encourage speakers and participants to honor personal preference whenever possible. We would also like to begin with the land acknowledgement. Although this conference is held virtually, we acknowledge the Indigenous peoples whose lands we occupy as we gather, learn, and collaborate. The community is headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on the traditional homelands of the Ho-Chunk Nation, the Menominee Nation, and the Potawatomi Nation, with enduring ties to the Ojibwa and Odawa peoples of the Councils of Three Fires. Moxie Educational Services is based in New Hampshire on the ancestral lands of the Abenaki and Pennacook people, whose histories, cultures, and sovereignty continue today. We honor their resilience, ongoing contributions, and enduring relationships to the land. This acknowledgement is only a beginning. We encourage all attendees to learn about the Indigenous nations whose lands they reside on and to support ongoing efforts toward Indigenous justice and sovereignty. Accessibility is a shared responsibility. Thank you for helping create a conference culture rooted in respect, care, and openness. American Sign Language interpreters are provided for each session, and captions are activated. To support blind and deaf blind attendees, we'll begin with a brief visual description. And so I will go first, and I will invite each of our panelists to do the same. I am a Latina female. I have silver black hair. I am wearing a dark long sleeve hoodie with the community logo. I have a portrait behind me. I have a plant stand behind me and a window to my left. I'm going to invite Amanda and Bobby to describe themselves as well.
Hello, I am a Caucasian female wearing a gray, pink, and white sweater with red hair, and my background is blurry.
Hi, I'm Bobby, and I have blonde hair. I'm wearing a black blazer, and my background is a beige wall with a picture on the back. And that's it.
Thank you, ladies. And so just as a reminder, this is going to be a question and answer forum. Bobby and Amanda and I are going to engage in some conversations and some questions around juveniles and the educational system and how that impacts the criminal legal system as well. I will start with just a brief description of my background. And so I have been with the community. I'm the director of operations for the community. I've been with the community now for 2 years. Prior to that, I was in the educational system for 23 years and really spanned a variety of educational settings from public schools to charter schools to private schools and multiple levels, all the way from K3 all the way to high school. And for the last 11 years, I transitioned from a math teacher into an administrative role. And so was part, either a school leader or part of the leadership team of schools for the last 11 years. And so that's the area of expertise that I'm bringing to the table, as well as my parenting. I do have 3 boys who are now 19, 21, and 31. So with that, I'm going to invite Amanda to pose the first question, and I'm going to answer it based on my experiences, and then I'm going to turn it back to Amanda and Bobby so that they can share what they're learning in their research. And before they speak as well, I'm going to invite them to just share who they are. So Amanda, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jen. My name is Amanda Hunter. I am a criminal justice graduate from SNHU. I am also the president of an online club for SNHU called the Law and Disorder Club. And I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Amanda. Go ahead with your first question.
When we talk about educational gaps for disabled youth, where do you most often see those gaps beginning, and what gets missed early on?
Yeah, that's a really great question because I think, it really highlights the importance of early childhood education. And so Disabilities are something that I heard an interesting statistic this morning in one of the early sessions that over 90% of disabilities are actually non-visible, right? And so if somebody's in a wheelchair, you can see that they are physically, mobily disabled, but so many of the disabilities aren't visible. And so it highlights the importance of early childhood education. It highlights the importance of like parents being able to spend quality time with their children so that those things can be seen and be diagnosed and just investigated early on. So really, it highlights the importance of early childhood education and the funding and how important that funding is for early childhood education, because that's really where it starts. Those primary teachers are going to be first. It starts at home, but then the primary teachers in the educational setting are going to be the first ones to recognize that maybe something is developing there, and maybe something needs to be investigated further. Experienced early childhood teachers are going to recognize that pretty quickly and then implement the proper protocol for students to be assessed, for students to be tested, for them to just experience a variety of things that are going to actually diagnose and recognize that. And when those things are missed early on, it just really creates a compounding spiral from there. So I can say that, as a principal, seeing those young kids in K3, K4, K5 settings, but also as a mom, especially to your first child, like that's the one that you, I think, are bonded with most because you have the most time with them. But it's also the newness of that. And so you get to experience like everything with them. It's new to you. You're really in tune with what they might be experiencing and what they're recognizing, meeting those milestones. Obviously with all of them, you do that, but especially with that first one. And so it highlights the importance of mothers and families being able to spend that quality time with their young children so that you can see if they're meeting those milestone markers. It highlights the importance of those regular pediatrician visits because that is something that they are also looking for. They want to make sure that they are reaching those milestones at the appropriate time. And if not, again, something's amiss or could be amiss. And so then we start investigating further. I'm curious, what you're finding in your research. I think you're muted.
I am. I'm
Amanda.
sorry.
Oh, okay.
What stood out to us during our research was the gaps often start early in identification and support. Many disabled youth face undiagnosed or the undocumented disabilities, leading to the academic struggles that actually get labeled as behavioral rather than disability related. Studies show that the youth special education needs are overrepresented in justice systems, partly because early school failures, like the poor reading skills and the math skills and the lack of early interventions, the increase of the dropout risk and delinquency pathways. When it gets missed, timely evaluations, appropriate IEPs and 504 plans, and addressing root causes instead of just the symptoms. And just to kind of bring together what an IEP and a 504 plan is, an IEP is developed under the Individuals with Disabled Education Act, the IDEA. It provides specialized instructions and related services, such as like speech therapy, occupational therapy for students who qualify under the age of 13, specifically disability categories and needs specifically designated instructions to access and progress in the curriculum. And a 504 plan comes from the section of 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, a civil rights law. It focuses on removing barriers so students can learn alongside peers in general education settings, and it typically provides accommodations, kind of like extended time on test, preferred seating, sometimes related to aids and services, but it does not include specialized instructions. So just to kind of have the difference between them both is what we came up with in all of our research.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I appreciate you giving those definitions, both IDEA and the 504 plan, and what the distinction is. One thing that I want to add to this is, I mentioned some of those milestones, right? And so just recognizing like where some of those skills are taught. And so reading skills are taught in K5 and first grade. And it's so, so important for students to be able to meet that milestone of learning how to read, the foundation of reading, um, the phonics, the phonemic awareness, the fluency, and how critical that is. Because if they miss it at that particular time slot, right, that window, then it's no longer taught. It's no longer taught in second grade, third grade. Now, what they're expected, it's strengthened, of course, but they're expected to actually use their reading skills now in all of their content areas. And so it really is the start. Like if we miss that for K-5 first grade students, it's going to compound and just really set them behind, because at every grade level, they're going to be expected to be reading at that particular grade level in all of their content areas. And so that early diagnosis is so critical, especially in these educational settings. So thank you for that. Bobby, I know you have a question. Do you mind introducing yourself prior to asking this question?
Yes, hello. I'm Bobby Browning. I am from SNHU. I'm a criminal justice major. I've been with SNHU for 3 years now, and I am in the Law and Disorder Club with Amanda. I am the secretary, and we're really excited to be here today.
Mhm.
Um, how do undiagnosed or undocumented disabilities shape the way student behavior is interpreted and disciplined in schools?
Yeah, what a great question. I'm so glad you asked that. As a teacher and as a first year teacher, you were just trying to survive the classroom, right? You're trying to just make it through. I want to get through this day. I want my students to learn. You don't necessarily have that experience to be able to deal with such a variety of behaviors or variety of learners. Um, and very often, as soon as somebody doesn't fit that mold of like, I'm listening, I'm following directions, as soon as somebody is out of the bounds of that, then we tend to, especially newer teachers tend to need support. And it's easiest to then remove that student from that educational setting when everybody else is following along with what you want them to do. And it just they get labeled right away as like a behavior problem, right? I'm the naughty child. This is the child that has the issue. And very often what happens is like they get excluded from those educational settings. They get excluded from those opportunities to learn. They get sent elsewhere. They get asked, if somebody else is watching them, just so that you can deliver. Now, it's true that as a teacher, the more experience you have, the better you are at navigating that variety of student in front of you and the behaviors they might display. And so I remember my first year, it was like, God help me. I'm just trying to make it through the day. And anything that was out of bounds is like, I don't know what to do here. But as you continue in your profession, you get better at that. But what it does is it labels that particular child. And so those children have then a reputation with others because you're moving them outside. Everybody sees that. And so it's like a physical, they're sent out. And so like they're labeled. There's a physical label. Students get to see them in that capacity. They see them removed. Teachers see that. And unfortunately, it's the start of some of what we see, some of the issues that we see later on, whether it's, falling behind academically, whether it's behavior issues, whether it's, now I'm being suspended, now I'm being expelled, whatever it might be. But that is the start of it. And so the ability of teachers to be able to manage that and manage it well is so critical. And if there is a student with a disability, knowing that so that you get the support that you need, so that you can make the appropriate accommodations, so you can make the modifications of the curriculum so that they can too be successful. What are you finding, Bobby, in your research?
Well, what surprised us is undiagnosed disabilities frequently lead to behaviors being seen as willful defiance rather than disability related, like impulsivity from ADHD, emotional dysregulation from trauma, or emotional disturbance. This results in differential treatment. Youth with disabilities face more punitive responses. Research highlights susceptibility theory. Up to 1/3 of arrested youth have disabilities, often because of behaviors tied to undiagnosed needs, triggers school exclusive instead of support.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Definitely, the importance of being able to recognize that early on is so critical. Thank you so much for that. Amanda.
What impact do punitive school practices like suspensions and zero tolerance policies have on disabled students, especially compared to supportive interventions?
That's a really great question. I think this is where we start to see the school to prison pipeline become really relevant, right, and visible for everyone, because some of those practices that are in a school setting kind of mirror what we see in the criminal legal system. Very punitive practices like I'm kicking this child out, I'm going to exclude them from this educational opportunity. And that really is probably the worst part of it, is that when we implement those punitive practices, we remove them from the learning environment. We remove that student. They don't have access to the same learning environment. They don't have access to their peers. They're not experiencing the same content, the same curriculum at grade level. They're not experiencing those social opportunities to grow with their peers, and it's just so detrimental to them. Similarly, right, we see that in the criminal legal system, where zero tolerance is like 3 strikes and you're out. And it's just so detrimental to the students. I think it's critical at this point for families to have a working relationship with teachers. I think it's so important for schools to be inclusive of those students and to be welcoming of those families, right? So we definitely want it to be a partnership between the student, the families, the school, in order to address the needs of those children, in order to keep them in the learning environment, in order to keep them with their peers and not stigmatize them in that way, not exclude them, not label them. But it's just super challenging. I will also say here that there's a real difference in the school system that you might be in. Public schools are very different than private schools. If you are in a public school setting, you are legally entitled to special education services, right? That is the law. If you choose then to take your child to a different school setting, like a private school, it's very different. And so you aren't entitled to the same legal services that you might be in a public school setting. And so there's a real difference here that I want to also highlight. I think it's going to come up a little bit further in our questioning as well. That is something that I want to just point out. It is very dependent on the school setting that you are in. How about you? What are you finding in your research?
So we found out that disciplinary practices are harmful to disabled students, nationally students with disabilities. About 15 to 17% of K through 12 enrollment receive around 29% of out of school suspensions. And in 2017 to 2018, 9% of students with disabilities were suspended out of school versus a 4% of non-disabled students. Similar, though, continues more of the recent data. This rules out the heightened risk of academic failures, like the dropout and the justice system involvement. And I also wanted to just circle back on what a IDEA is. It's an Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is the main federal law originally passed in 1975 as the Educational for All Handicapped Children Act, guaranteeing students with disabilities of a free, appropriate public education, which is FAPE, in the latest restrictive environment. It covers about 14 to 15% of public school students. It requires evaluations like the IEPs and stuff like that, such as requiring a determination review for long-term suspensions to check the behavior stems from disability. And the zero tolerance approach can violate the IDEA by distributing these required supports without proper progress, worsening the outcomes for these students.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I see some questions over here in the Q&A. I know we're going to come to these at the end. But one that I see is, how long has 504 and IEP existed? And I don't know, I also saw a chat saying that somebody was finding it hard to hear what Amanda was saying. So I just want to point that out, that the IDEA is a federal law, and it was originally passed in 1975. So I hope that helps you, just kind of that context and with that information. So thank you so much for that. Bobby, you have a question.
Yes, I do. When the students move between schools or experience homelessness or become court involved, what tends to happen to their educational plans and disability supports?
This is a really great question. And I think it's also an appropriate time to just talk about the different school settings. Going to give a little bit of background because this is also where vouchers come into play. And I know Wisconsin was kind of at the forefront when school vouchers were first started. I want to say in the early 90s. Wisconsin was part of that. And now, I'm really starting to see that go national where almost all states now have a voucher program. So I want to take just a moment and introduce what that is. So public school settings, taxpayers pay into the fund that supports all public schools, right? And public universities. And what the voucher system does in Wisconsin is called either the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program. There's also one in a city just south of us here called the Racine Parental Choice Program. And it is parental choice for a reason. And what it is because parents, all families pay into this taxpayer system, it allows parents to then say, I want the taxpayers that support my child's education or the tax dollars that support my child's education to go to a particular school. So they might be able to take their child into a private school setting, whether it's religious or not, and use taxpayer funds to pay for that tuition. Traditionally, before that, private schools were tuition funded, like 100% tuition funded, and maybe foundation funded. But so with the introduction of voucher systems now, right, parents are then able to say, nope, I'd rather them be educated in this particular setting and use those taxpayer funds for that. Here's, and I was a teacher in Catholic schools. I was a principal in Catholic schools. And so I am in support of parents having that choice, but there's a real distinction because when children are in a public school setting, it is the law that requires those students who have a disability to get the services that they need. When they go to a private school, that is no longer the case. Now, I have experience here in Milwaukee, so I can say that when a child is in a Catholic school setting, the public school system is responsible for doing the testing if that child is suspected of having a disability and parents request that. That's a very important distinction. Parents actually have to request that. But the public school is then responsible for doing the testing and developing an IEP for that child. The only way that the child is then going to receive those services that are listed in the IEP is if they are in that public school setting. And so that's a real dilemma for students who have disabilities who are in a private school setting. It doesn't mean that the school can't accommodate and make accommodations for some of their needs, but they aren't required by law to be able to provide those services. And so, we talk about like moving between schools. What's the disadvantage of that? It's you sometimes go from a school setting where you're required by law to receive the services that you need to going to a school setting where you no longer do. And then again, from there, students continue to fall behind. They continue to get removed from classes. They continue to get suspended. And parents don't have a lot of recourse at that point because they're no longer required by law to provide those services. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a distinction there. What happens when students move between schools? Another thing is that their records don't necessarily follow them. If a student who has a disability is in one particular school, they are known by those teachers. They are known by the special education providers and are getting the services that they need, right? You take that child and you move them elsewhere, then records might not necessarily follow them. Ideally, in theory, you would think those records would automatically be in a new school setting, but they aren't always. And so there's that gap. Even if they go from one public school to another public school, there's a gap in those records following them and for services to be implemented right away. Then we think about what happens to that child emotionally and socially. They're starting new with their peers. They're having to make friends. They're having to make connections with the school. They're having to build those relationships. And so it immediately sets them back socially. Schools are cliquey, especially when you get to middle school. Unfortunately, they're cliquey. And so being able to then find a friend group that you trust and find individuals that you trust, like it's harder to do. It's harder to break into those groups. And so, yeah, I have found in my practice here that parents tend to, as soon as there's an issue, it's like, oh, I'm taking my child, we're moving, without realizing the repercussions of what that does to your child, right? That instability of going from one setting to another is pretty traumatic for a child, especially for a student with disabilities. For somebody who has to try harder in their academic classes, who has to try harder in their social groups to make friends. And so it is super, super disruptive to a child, to their growth, to their psyche, their sense of identity and who they are, is super challenging for them. What are you finding in your research?
Well, I found that transitions disrupt continuity. IEP's 504 plans often aren't transferred promptly, leading to loss of services. Homelessness or mobility exacerbates gaps in records and advocacy. Once court involved or incarcerated, education shifts dramatically. Many facilities provide substandard schooling and disability needs. Special ed services are inconsistently handled despite high eligibility rates. Up to 85% in some juvenile facilities qualify for special ed, but far fewer receive it. This creates a school to prison to school cycle where support drops off precisely when needed the very most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed it does. Thanks for sharing that.
So, what barriers do families face when trying to advocate for disabled youth within schools or justice system? And where do those efforts tend to break down?
Yeah, that's a big question. So, what barriers do families face when trying to advocate for their students, for their youth, especially when they have disabilities? It's an extensive list of barriers that they face. I can start by saying, socioeconomically, parents, single parents, parents who are just trying to get by, are very often working, working full-time jobs. They don't have the ability to leave their job, to be able to reach out to the school, to be able to come in and attend an IEP meeting, right? Or to attend regular meetings that they might need to have in order to experience and really find that sweet spot for success for their children. So time-wise, they don't have that luxury very often. Not to mention English language learners. We have a lot of immigrant families in our cities and our school systems. And so when you have English language learners, I can speak for the Latino community because I worked in a Latino community. I am a Latina. I am from the border. I'm second generation. So, I have experience in that realm as well. But there's a huge language gap. Latino families tend to, and this is again just a broad stereotype that I'm saying, but Latino families tend to really trust the educational setting and the school setting. In Latin American countries, the teacher is it. Like the teacher is the premier individual. They know everything. They're the end all be all for their child's education. And so they tend to just trust what the schools say. Obviously, it's a different country, it's a different school setting. But then there's also the language barrier. If I speak a completely different language, I'm not going to feel comfortable approaching, or don't always feel comfortable approaching the school. You have to ask for interpreting services. You have to make sure somebody on staff is speaking your language, and then speaking it to a degree where you can understand it, right? Breaking it down for you. And again, very different cultures. So you're learning a different culture. You're asking for things you don't know necessarily what your children might need, what to even ask for. So there's some real, barriers that families encounter when they need to address what their children need. They need to address their individual needs. Yeah. How about you? What are you finding?
So, what actually stood out to me the most was families often they face the knowledge gaps, mainly not knowing what their rights are under the 504 or the IEP. Resources, the limitations, like the time, the money, advocates, lawyers, bias, schools and juvenile systems minimizing the disability needs, and communication breakdowns. Our first breakdown and evaluation, the IEP meetings, like, they might be delayed or denied during the discipline proceedings or justice settings. And poverty and language barriers and fear of retaliation add the layers, especially for certain families or some families.
Yeah, I'm gonna say it because it really is something, especially right now, that is a barrier for families. Our immigrant families right now are scared, essentially, right? And so to reach out to the school to ask for help, they interpret that as like shedding light on, like, okay, I'm here. And so very often, whether their children were born here or not, they're entitled to an education here. And so they're just scared. They don't want to come out. They're hiding right now. There's a lot of fear in our communities right now because of ICE. Um, and so that is keeping a lot of families from reaching out to schools and from asking for the help that they might need. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard as a parent to know what you can get, what kind of supports your children can get when you don't know that, right? And you don't know that unless you're having conversations with the school. And the schools as well need to be proactive and reach out to families and students when they see that gap and when they see those needs. So yeah, thank you for that. I don't want to get political, but I want to just acknowledge that because it is a real fear.
Once a young person becomes court involved or incarcerated, how does their education typically change, and how are disability needs handled at that point?
Hmm. Yeah. This again, if they are part of a public school system, whether they are in a school, at home, in a hospital, incarcerated, they are still legally entitled to a free and appropriate public education. And so theoretically, that is supposed to follow them no matter where they are. Now, we know we have an imperfect system here, and it doesn't necessarily happen, right? And so once a student is involved with the justice system, they might not necessarily get the support that they need. Typically, those students who we in schools we are suspending the most, that we are expelling, the ones that are being kicked out of their classes, are usually those who struggle with the content. Those are the ones who are struggling to learn, right? They're the ones who are acting out as a way to deflect from the fact that, like, I might not know this math, I might not be able to read this, so let me do something else. And it is drawing the attention in a negative way of those teachers. And so those students are typically the ones, let me phrase it another way. The students who are incarcerated are typically the ones who struggle in schools the most, and for a variety of things are then set on a path to encounter the justice system in a different way. And so it's going to continue to set them back. We very frequently say that education is wasted on the youth. And this is one of those reasons. Like, students don't recognize the importance of having educational success, and finding that success until they are older. And very frequently, working with an incarcerated population or hearing more from those who are incarcerated, like, they are craving education at this point. They now recognize, but they're older, and they recognize the fact that, like, I missed that opportunity when I had it. Now I'm trying to get those opportunities back. So unfortunately, once a young person is caught up in the justice system, it spirals from there. They don't necessarily get the support that they need. They don't necessarily get the education that they're entitled to, unfortunately, until they themselves have to seek it out in a different way. What is the research telling you?
We found that education often becomes fragmented or inadequate. Many facilities offer limited hours. Instruction and quality varies very widely. Disability needs are frequently unmet despite 1/3 plus of justice involved youth qualifying for special ed. Services are inconsistent, like no IEPs followed, lack of trained staff. Probation youth with special ed needs show higher recidivism when school exclusion continues. And the system shifts from rehabilitation education to control, deepening the pipeline rather than interrupting it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Indeed. I'm sorry if you hear a puppy barking in the background here. Apologies, we have a puppy.
Well, you could redesign one part of the system to better support disabled youth and prevent justice involvement. Where would you start and why?
Hmm. It's a great question because there's so many parts of the system that have gaps that could be addressed. Um, puppy needs treats, yes. I I think there's really something to that early childhood education. Um, I think that is the point in a student's life where you can really see how um, students might be missing something, whether it's socially, whether it's academically, or present manifests itself in another way. That's really where you can start to identify it. So, not every state funds early childhood education. I think it's crucial. Only one of my children was, able to experience it, and it was the last one. And it was an eye opener to me. I was a teacher, and I didn't realize the importance of early childhood education. Um, but it was huge for him. It just gave him that edge, helped him integrate into a different kind of setting, a social setting. So there's so many things that come out. Again, it's not all academic. You might see a child struggle to just interact with other kids, right? That highlights they might have different needs and in other ways that don't necessarily affect the academics, but just other ways that it might manifest itself. So I think early childhood education would be a starting point for me. I think we can fund our schools in different ways that don't pit, even in one school district. I think individual schools within that district are pitted against each other because they're funded based on the number of students that they have, right? And that then dictates the staffing that they can support. So I think there's funding changes that we can implement to make sure that every school is successful, that you have the resources that you need. I know, even in a public school that is funded, has special education teachers, we still struggle, to make sure that all of the students have the support that they needed. There weren't as many, special education teachers in the schools that we needed. And so you're very often like, struggling to like plug them in a way that is going to make a difference in those students' lives and really support the teachers and support the students. And so I would change the funding structure a little bit. Um, I think teacher education programs do a really nice job. There's maybe something to be said to like having more mentors in place. There's quite a few retired teachers who are amazing, and 3 on staff, even just at the community, who are just incredible. I think there's that mentorship that could be put into place with like, retired teachers and mentoring new teachers when they start. Even without pay, I think there's a lot of people in our society who have that experience who would love to come back in and just foster that development of the young teachers, right? So there's so many things that I think we could do. What are you finding, and what would you like to see happen if you had, your magic wand to wave?
So, um, I did look into this, and there's a lot of sources that actually they pointed out early identification and intervention in schools as like the strong like starting point
Mhm.
to come better screening for disabilities, reducing the discipline and replace it with positive supports instead, and ensuring the IEPs could prevent, a lot of things. Data shows that school failures is a key to pathway. Addressing it upstream reduces the liability to justice involvement. Other strong redesigns is training for educators or juvenile staff on disabilities, and family advocacy supports and cross-system coordination would be great to see.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Yeah. Bobby, do you have an answer to that one?
Um, it, I don't.
Yeah. Teacher training could do a lot here, I think. I am fortunate that I have a sister who's a special education teacher in Milwaukee Public Schools. Whenever I had a question, I'd run to her. I was like, wait, make sure, help me understand this and tell me what we need to do. I spent, I think the last 11 years really in Catholic schools. And so, I'd get to hear from her like what it would look like in a public school setting and what we could implement in our private school setting. Helping our staff, I think, feel more comfortable asking for the support, making sure that the students who are in front of them have what they need and just be able to vocalize that. I don't necessarily think all schools have the culture where we ask for the support that we need. We advocate for the students in front of us. And when we see something happening, like we need to investigate that a little bit further. So I think we can even, shift the cultures that we have in schools, but it's a lot. I say that knowing very well that it's a lot that would need to change and to be put into place. So ladies, thank you so much. I'm going to transition over to our Q&A, and I think we have some questions in here. Let me see. Okay, many females with autism are diagnosed later than males. Since signs may be different and are less studied, what are the most important things to look for as an educator? In terms of autism, it's a really great question. I don't even know that I have an answer to that. I would look for isolation in students. I would look for individuals who don't necessarily socialize in the same way. Students who are having trouble making friends. Those are the things that would tip me off to like, there might be something here, something that I would encourage teachers to look for as well. Yeah, I don't know if that answers that question, but those are the clues that I think I would maybe look for. I have another question here. Ladies, unless you have seen something in your research that you want to add to that.
No, I think we dug so much into the question research. We kind of didn't broadly look into everything. We were so big into that one big research for all those questions.
I see another question here. Is there a gap for individual people in school and incarcerated places? Follow-up questions. Are there any ways to get readers for people that don't understand what they learn, especially for testing? And so I think the question there might relate to just like, there are testing accommodations. Some of the accommodations might be reading questions out loud, as opposed to having students read the questions themselves, right? So reading the questions to students, accommodations for both in-class assessments as well as standardized tests that are required by the state. There's definitely those accommodations. And I have certainly implemented those as well. When I was teaching, I was a math teacher. So it didn't have as much to do with reading as it did with numbers and, equations and formulas. But yeah, there are certainly ways that you can read the questions for students to help them understand that. You can certainly ask what they are interpreting. How do they interpret this question and helping them? You can't do that on standardized tests, but certainly in class tests, you can do that. Even with math, I did that frequently. Tell me what you're understanding or what you think you need to do. So yeah, ladies, any answers for that question?
Sorry, I was looking at the chat. I'm trying to see the questions
It's
in the chat.
distracting. There's so many comments in there. I haven't even looked at it for that reason.
I got fully distracted on the comments.
No worries. I
I'm trying to catch
see.
up to the beginning.
I see. Do you know of any program that help children who are incarcerated with an IEP/ADA needs and transitioning to adult prisons? Yeah, I think this is, I don't know of any programs that help individuals who are incarcerated, who have special education needs. However, I will highlight that Ben Wright, one of our colleagues at the community, is currently engaged in a disability access and higher education programs project. And so he is looking nationally at what the landscape is, what kind of accommodations are already out there, what do those HEP programs look like nationally, what do DOC staff implement, if anything. And so he is putting together a training manual that will be used to support that. That is also going to be available to departments of corrections. It's going to be, available to corrections officers. And then he will be going back out to those sites that he is working with to conduct the training. But we are also taking those lessons, those manuals, and we're going to make them, turn them into an online course that is going to be available to everybody. So I will say that. And I do see some comments in the chat. So some of the resources that you might be looking at, if you put a question in the Q&A, some of those resources might be available in the chat. Are there ways to help the juvenile in the jails and prison systems and resources, especially when there's a language gap? I do not currently know of any support that, not only do I know of supports that are available in educational systems that are in jails, in prisons, but I also don't know of any language support that is available. I think language support, even in K-12 systems, is challenging to come by, even though it is legally required. It's still not always readily available. Here is another question. Are schools responsible for informing parents, families of their rights? Really great question. Yes, they are responsible for informing students and families of their rights. Doesn't necessarily mean it always happens. And so again, I think the importance of parents and families as advocates for their children, this is where that comes into place. And so parents have to be the ones to request an evaluation. Teachers can make the suggestion to the parents. They can provide the parents with the evidence of why they're making that suggestion. Schools can, suggest it as much as they want to parents, but until the parent actually makes the request, it's not necessarily going to happen. So again, here's the importance of a really great working relationship between families and school systems. In Washington State, DOC makes education mandatory for all incarcerated individuals who do not have a GED or high school diploma. Amazing. I wish that we had that nationwide. I don't think that's the case, state by state. So that is incredible. And then here's one more comment. Disabilities that have not been viewed the same since 1970s. It is true that as more disabilities were added to the list, teachers don't recognize them all, right? Because those disabilities don't necessarily have to be accommodated. And that is true. Not all disabilities have accommodations. That is absolutely true. And there is a long list that all educators aren't necessarily familiar with. So, ladies, anything else to add? You've been amazing. I love that students are taking the lead here, that you're going to be our future, decision makers, and that this topic in particular is important to you.
Yeah.
Well, go
Go
ahead,
ahead, Bobby.
Amanda.
I'm sorry. Oh, go ahead.
I had a reading disability in school, and I just wanted to say, backtrack to where you said the kids feel left out. And I felt that way. It was very, I had to go out into the hallway with a special lady to read. And I just felt excluded from everyone. So I can relate.
Yeah, Bobby, thank you for sharing that that vulnerable, insight. So absolutely, students know when there is something different, right? And they do feel excluded. They want very much to fit in with their peer groups, and anything that makes them feel otherwise is damaging. It's traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda.
I was just gonna say, I've learned so much during this research and being a part of this. I actually want to work in correctional, juvenile, the word's not coming to my brain, but that's what I want to do after graduation. So I've learned a lot with this, and now it kind of made me think even more about what I want to do and how to help more.
Well, fabulous. I'm glad it sparked an interest in pursuing that. We certainly need you. Bobby and Amanda, thank you so much. Thank you for all who were able to attend this session. I hope you're walking away with some key insights. I know there's lots of stuff going on in the chat. I'm certain that Ben has some resources in there and some connections. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of you. One of the staples of Stop the Stigma is highlighting the work of students. That's exactly what we did today. Um, I am certain that Bobby and Amanda will both excel and be successful in everything that they do once they graduate and move on. Um, and John Vega, thank you for your expertise. I've been chatting with a couple of people, and they were like, John Vega is the expert in this space. And you were so eloquent and so awesome. I don't know if you noticed, but 3 or 4 people in the chat were saying how much they learned from you and how much you helped them. And yeah, so
Thank
thank you
you.
for that. And Dr. Montag, thank you for leaving a whole lot of resources in the chat. Um, just so everyone knows, we are making a resource, or I'm making a resource guide specifically about stop the stigma and all the resources that have been given throughout the conference. That will come out probably a week or two. I'll give myself 2 weeks to do it, to finish. So look out for that. Thank you so much for attending. We have until 6:30 Eastern. At 6:30 Eastern, we will have a live reading of Brick by Brick, which is a play, which is the premiere reading of the play about a deaf man who was wrongfully incarcerated. And it's about his journey before, during, and after prison. I can, well, I was the one who wrote the play, so I don't want to sound like I'm, self-serving or anything, but it's pretty powerful and emotional and covers pretty much everything we have talked about at this conference. The chat will be open from now until 6:30, and you are more than welcome to stay. You can leave, buy a break, get some food, whatnot. If you want to stay and chat, we'll be here. So hopefully you'll come back at 6:30 Eastern. That's why not an hour and a half from now. So see you
Thank
then,
you so
I hope.
much. Thank you to the interpreters as well.
Thank you, John, again.
Thanks, Ben.
I'm not going anywhere. I'll be right here for the open shut. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, John.